Yeah, I was the chief of medical plans and operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, so I was on the E-ring of the Pentagon when the plane hit. But I think the better part is to start with the day before. The day before 9/11, obviously September 10th, we'd been given orders to report to a helicopter that was going to take us outside the Pentagon near the executive entrance to Andrews Air Force Base on the morning of 9/11 to participate in, at the time, a very highly classified exercise, which involved the NOAC, the National Air, or the NAOC, the National Airborne Operations Center, sometimes more derisively called the Doomsday Plane. My major collateral duty as the Chief of Medical Plans and Response and Operations for the Joint Chiefs of Staff was to also serve as the medical response advisor to the President of the United States on night watch in the event that there would be a national catastrophe. And most of the scenarios we worked involving the use of night watch or the NAOC were nuclear war with the former Soviet Union, or nuclear attack, in this case, is the exercise scenario for on Washington, D.C. So the morning of 9/11, I left my house at about 4:30 in the morning, about a half an hour earlier than I usually left. I was responsible for preparing the chairman's, the medical and public health intelligence input for the chairman's daily operations and intelligence brief. And I was waiting for a phone call to notify me to rally at the point where the helicopter was going to pick us up to take us over to Andrews and board the plane. Before that happened, though, at about 8:46 exactly, the Joint Staff Surgeon, Rear Admiral John Mattis, had come into our office and was having coffee with our Chief of Staff, gentleman by the name of Colonel Charles Davis. And he, as part of his normal function, would eat a donut and drink a cup of coffee. And he and the Colonel would discuss the day's events while watching Katie Couric and Matt Lauer on NBC News in the Colonel's office. Besides the Admiral, I was the only other person on the staff at the time from New York City. So the first thing I heard was the Admiral yell out my name quite loudly and say, "Come in here right away." So I got up from my desk, probably 30 or 40 feet from where the Colonel's office was, and I went right towards his office, and the Admiral was standing in the doorway with his back to me. And as I approached, he turned sideways and pointed at the television and said, "Look at this." And I could see the hole in the South Tower. And the first reaction I had was, wow, they must have let a plane into the airspace. In fact, it reminded me of an accident that occurred in 1945, right at the tail end of World War II, when a B-24 bomber, I believe that's the correct nomenclature of the plane, but an Army Air Corps bomber in thick fog had crashed into the Empire State Building.
I remember that story.
Killed a pilot and killed a number of people who were working in the offices. And it looked like a flying saucer. There was a large hole for the fuselage and then the two wings. And that's exactly what the hole in the South Tower initially looked like. So my first reaction was, I said to the Admiral, I said, "Oh my God, somebody must have gotten into the New York airspace and accidentally crashed in the tower." And he looks at me in typical New York language. We appreciate this from one another. He says, "Don't be a freaking idiot." Not the word he used. They're not allowed to fly planes that close into the buildings. That's a tightly controlled airspace. And I said, "Yeah, maybe, but I don't know." And no sooner had I said that than we saw the second plane come and hit the North Tower, at which time the three of us, Colonel Curtis, myself, and Admiral Madison, said, "We're under attack." That was a purposeful attack using civilian jetliners. So we watched this in awe and fear about what was happening to our country for, I don't know, perhaps another time. Time was a very funny thing at that point. We were watching this unfold on television. At the same time, we're trying to figure out what's going to happen. We have a new organization within the J3 relatively new organization within the J3 Operations Directorate of the Joint Staff called the DISCA office, and that stood for Defense Support to Civil Authorities. So naturally, when we started to realize this was a purposeful terrorist attack, we thought that the DoD would have a pretty significant role in having to respond with what we at the time called consequence management to the attack. Now the term of art is incident management, to match the words we use for the National Incident Management System and Incident Command System, NIMS and ICS. So we sat in the office watching the news and watching this unfold, the horror in New York. We actually started to see people, they showed on camera, people beginning to come from the towers to essentially or theoretically die a faster death than being burned to death in that horrible
it was horrific
conflagration. And a contractor named John Curtis had joined us. John was a retired Army Medical Service Corps Lieutenant Colonel, really sharp guy, was the only civilian we had in the office. And he was sitting in Colonel Davis's desk because we had all, taken standing positions and were watching the television. And John's sitting there with his hands pursed like this, not really looking at the TV. He was obviously in deep thought. And I became fascinated just looking at him. At first, why aren't you watching the TV like the rest of us? This is history. I mean, this is really bad. It's history. And I didn't understand why he wasn't riveted to the TV like we were. And I said, John, what are you thinking? And he looks up briefly at us and he goes, they're coming for us. We're under attack. And not more than 15 seconds after those words had left his mouth, we hear and feel the concussion on the building. Room shifted left and then shifted back. And the attack, of course, was 2 corridors over, about 600 to 900 feet from where we were. So we were relatively close on the E-ring to the impact, and we heard, of course, and felt the tremendous noise and concussion. And another guy, an Air Force major, a nurse named Mike Boudreau, had joined us, and he was standing right behind me. And we were all thrown, and Mike actually fell, and we thought he broke his shoulder. He fell so hard. But before anybody could say anything, you need help, the Admiral grabs me by the back of my collar, and he throws me forward, and he says, "Get everybody out. We've just been attacked, and I don't know if more is coming. Get everybody out now." So we were all in SCIFs, sensitive compartmented information facilities, classified areas, the Pentagon, where we did the business of the Joint Staff and the Armed Services on a daily basis. We were working very highly classified material regularly, and our doors all had cipher locks on them, if not, the retinal scans that were just coming to be popular, to get you in and out of the National Military Command Center, which was just down the hall. So I opened my door and I start banging on the other offices of the J4 Logistics Directorate. The Medical Readiness Division was part of it. We were embedded in the J4. And I'm banging on doors and people are opening up, and they, of course, must have been watching their own TV sets and they're wide-eyed. And I'm like pulling people down and throwing them towards the door that leads to the E-ring. And people are running out, and I kind of get pushed out with them. First thing I see, I look to my left, and there's this massive smoke billow coming at me at it seemed like 90 miles an hour, and the heavy smell of JP5 jet fuel, which I recognized because of the carrier tour on the USS Enterprise previously. And out of the smoke billow comes the first people come out is this woman who I swore at the time was Sheila Widnall, who'd been the first female Secretary of the Armed Forces, part of our armed forces. She's been the Secretary of the Air Force. And she's holding up and carrying this man who was I had a clinical background as a former corpsman and an emergency medical technician, so I'd seen people in deep shock before. And this guy was in deeper shock than anybody had ever seen. He was completely gray. I mean, near death gray. His eyes looked like big saucer. The wild thing about it, ashen, totally ashen. And the wild thing about it was it looked, if you remember the TV cartoons of the 60s, with the Roadrunner and, all the explosions he'd go through, and the characters would sometimes have their clothes blown off and it looked like they'd been shredded. It looked like somebody had taken scissors and cut his suit into complete shreds, and there was blood all over his chest and all. And I didn't have time to help her or help him, because as I looked to my right, I'm right at it's called the Chairman's Corridor. I think it's Corridor 9. And there's this human wave of, it's the only way I could describe it, as a human wave or wall of people that are rushing at me in stark, utter terror. I mean, screaming, men and women just screaming at the top of their lungs, trying to get away from the epicenter of the blast, which as you get closer to the inside, you're closer at the end to where the blast occurred, and 2 wings over, the plane had penetrated all the way through to the D ring. The C ring, which is even closer. So they're running, and we being me and 3 or 4 of the other action officers from the Joint Staff, get carried by this human wave. And the closest door outside of the building is called the river entrance. So it's where the chairman's office is. It's where the chairman comes in every morning. And 1 flight up is the Secretary of Defense's office. So that's where this is where Secretary Rumsfeld comes in every morning. So we get pushed out the door, and everybody simultaneously looked up, and we could see a mushroom cloud. And the first thing we thought was this a plane, or did we just get hit with a tactical nuke? Because the fireball is going up at that point, it's 300-400 feet already, and this massive cloud was forming. And as I turned to look, I'm standing next to this guy named Jeff. His last name escapes me at the moment. He was another Air Force major. And we were assigned as watch officers to the National Military Command Center. So we go, holy crap, not the words we use. We've got to get back in, because we're going to be the ones we're going to help coordinate the response to this. Now we think Washington's under attack. We know New York is under attack. So we turn around, and we have, of course, our Pentagon badges. I just happened to find one, the old one the other day, that allowed me access to the NMCC. And as soon as we turned around, by then the Defense Security Police had put on black balaclava hoods and black uniforms, and they're carrying miniguns that are strapped to their chests. And they were ready for battle. I mean, we didn't know what was coming. These guys were sure ready. And as Jeff and I turned to go back up the stairs, they bore down on us and pulled the slides on the weapons. And we went, Joint Staff, NMCC watch officers, we're the medical guys. We have to get back in to help with the response. So I'll only talk just a few more minutes. Just one more extremely notable event. We get into the NMCC, and it's, as you can expect, bedlam. And smoke and fire are already coming through the ceilings between the floors. So the NMCC is getting filled up with smoke very rapidly. So I look at the phone, and we can touch anybody. In there I can reach any combatant commander, medical staff, operations staff, plant staff, anybody. I can talk to the 4 stars if I have to. If I'm the last guy left or the first guy they need to talk to. Remember, there is no Northcom at that time. So somebody to call and say, this is your backyard, you're in charge. So I start calling New York because I knew about how the offices of emergency management were architected around the United States, because we've been hearing about the attack through the Pulse chatter since 1998, and I'd seen and read the messages that were we did too. Yeah. So anyway, I'm looking about who to call, and you can't get through, because when the attack first occurred, the grid got shut down. I don't know why. I know that we purposefully shut the grid down later so that we could keep clear channel comms open for the military and emergency management response assets. But I couldn't get anybody at that moment. But while I'm doing this, I see these 2 gentlemen being brought in. And one is too short to know who it is at first, because he's surrounded by 4 of these Defense Protective Service guys with the balaclavas and the miniguns. And they've got him in the middle with their backs all to him. And they're moving, like shuffling down the walkway to where the watch boss is. And right behind him, you can see a much taller guy, and that was General Dick Myers, who was the deputy chairman or the vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, a very tall man. So they get to the NMCC ops boss desk. This is the 1-star who each of the services source a guy for watch periods, I believe 6 hours a day. And this one was a Navy guy. And the guy that was too short for me to see at first turns out to be Rumsfeld. And I'm no more than 10, 12 feet from them, because the door to the ops boss cell is right next to my cell, the medical cell for the J4. And the ops boss turns to him and he says, "Vice President, Mr. Secretary." And they turn their heads, and Cheney pops up on, it's a red switch screen that we thought it was attached to the Situation Room at the time, but he'd already been evacuated to a bunker. And he called Rumsfeld to start giving orders. Remember, Bush was not there in Washington. Mm-hmm. He was just getting on his plane, and they hadn't established comms with him. Or maybe he and Cheney had talked, but Cheney was the one who passed the orders on to what was going to have to happen. And Rumsfeld says, and you could hear both voices because they're on the open mic, and we're in a classified center, so we don't have to put it on a stew and hear it encrypted or anything. So Cheney and Rumsfeld says, "Yes, Mr. Vice President." And Cheney says, "Shoot anything down that comes in the airspace." And he goes, and Rumsfeld says, "What are you talking about?" He goes, "Airliners, anything that enters the airspace, shoot it down." And Rumsfeld's eyes get wide, and he looks at Myers, and Myers goes, "Yeah, I guess." And Rumsfeld turns back to Cheney on the viewer screen, and he says, "Are you talking about civilian airliners? You want us to shoot civilian airliners down that enter the airspace?" And Cheney's response was, "Who the blank do you think did this in the first place? Take them out." So Rumsfeld turns to the general and says, "Give the order, get the planes up, light the SAMs up right across the river, and anything that comes in, shoot it down." And just then, almost, it was like you could have scripted this better, we hear this. Turns out it was an F-15 Eagle that launched from Langley, and he went on Mach 2 afterburners. He was up there in like 45 seconds, and he comes screaming over the building. I mean, he must have been, and there's a very famous painting now, Eagle on Station, I think is the name of it, that's in the Air Force main corridor where the Chief of Staff is. And he comes screaming about 150, 200 feet over the Pentagon, and banks left starboard or port to go right by the fireball. And the painting depicts this young major who's leaning over looking. Well, he didn't know at the time, he'd forgotten to put on his friend or foe indicator on his jet, so they painted. And they were just about to shoot him down when somebody with enough wherewithal said, "No, that's a friendly. He's a fast mover. It can't be another civilian airline. It's got to be one of ours. Otherwise, that young pilot would have been gone. He would have just been incinerated in the air." So,
which is almost a classic example of the fog of war.
Yeah. So long story short, we had to evacuate because the fire was coming through the ceiling, and Rumsfeld told us all to go to Site R, which is a classified location out in the Catoctin Mountains, which is the alternate National Military Command Center. So we were ordered to find any transportation available and get out there. And the last point about that day is, as soon as I get there, the J3 is there ahead of us. It was a Marine 2-star. And I walk in to the ops center, and he goes, "Are you Marghella?" And I said, "Yeah." And I said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "You're the medical guy, right? The medical ops guy?" I said, "Yeah." He says, "You take this call." And it turned out to be, it was PK Carlton who was on the phone. He's Surgeon General of the Air Force. Turned out that prior to him speaking to me, he and another guy, David Tarantino, and Rumsfeld had rushed to the site of the crash and had pulled victims out literally while molten steel was melting on their backs. And Rumsfeld never wanted anybody to tell that story, but I knew it firsthand. And Tarantino and Dr. Carlton, both were physicians, both became two of the main heroic players of 9/11 in terms of extricating victims out of the impact site, that all but one of them lived. And Tarantino's uniform was subsequently put on display in the Smithsonian. In any event, I get on the phone with Carlton, and now Carlton is up in a he's up in a storm of excitement, and he goes, "Listen, I want you to tell the chairman and the Secretary of Defense I'm sending a 500-bed air transportable hospital up from the Joint Base in New Jersey." And I said, "Whoa." I said, "Sir, nobody has asked for that. You can't do that yet." I said, "We've got to wait for the civil authorities who are in charge of the site to call us and say, this is what I need." And I said, first, I was gonna explain to him that I'm from New York. It's a very congested area. He says, "Listen, son," he says, "if you had friends and loved ones in New York City at this moment, you'd want to have everything you could possibly have up there for them." And I said, "General, I was born and raised in New York City." And that just shut him up for about 20 seconds flat. While I said, "Look, don't do anything. You can't just send stuff. It's got to go through the JDOMs, the Director of Military Support, for approval, and then they go up to Secretary of Defense cables. They get the policy approval to send it, and then it can flow. It also means that the money will come behind it to support a deployment, which end up costing $100 million. But
you first have to assess what logistics and that you need.
As soon as I say this, the ops boss from the Joint Staff is still there, and he goes, "Oh, I got another one for you." And this time he hands me the phone, and it's Giuliani. It's Mayor Giuliani and Governor Pataki on a party line, right? It's a three-way call. And he said, and Giuliani says, "Who are you?" And I said, "I'm Commander Marghella." I said, "I'm the Chief of Medical Plans and Ops for the Joint Chiefs." And he goes, "Listen," he says, you might be just the right guy for us to talk to." He says, we just want the chairman. We can't get a hold of the chairman. We can't get a hold of SecDev. We want the chairman and SecDev to know that they should not send a single body up to New York City to try and help us, because we're already, our avenues of egress for the people who are moving away from this, the bridges were almost closed, the tunnels were on a complete lock.
Everything was full.
Everything was full. And he says, you couldn't get a Humvee over any one of the points of entrance to the city right now. So he says, don't send anything. Because if you do, you guys will completely compromise the logistics mission that we're going to have to attack when we finally figure out how bad this is. Remember, this is now, it's the towers collapsed maybe a half an hour after this conversation. So there was a lot of right. So, and that's kind of a good segue, Tony. I think that the last what I should talk about is really what 9/11 represented and how it's a missed lesson. In many ways.
I want to ask you a real quick question. Correct me if I'm wrong, but they were lucky at the Pentagon because you were familiar with the Pentagon renovation program, PenRen.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Am I correct that wing was the first wing to have actually been completed and reinforced before the other rings were under the PenRen program? Actually,
it's just the opposite. It's just the opposite, which they were in reverse grateful for, because they'd already spent hundreds of millions of dollars. The plane hit right at almost top dead center on the Navy Command Center, and below it one of the Army's main posts within the building, and that was the wedge section that was still. I thought it was I don't like the change to it. It was almost a museum when you would walk through it that just breathed history. And the Navy wedge, if you will, was lined with mahogany walls with all of these old original oil paintings of secretaries of the Navy and or chiefs of naval operations, pictures of naval war heroes and major ships of war, men of war. And so when the plane hit, it was one of the few sections that they had not started the wedge renovation. And in the long run, they thought that they ended up saving money because they're probably going to have to take out most of that and reconstruct it from scratch to begin with. And that's what ended up happening. But no, it was just the opposite. I remember, I know this very distinctly because 2 nights later, I went up. I was on the watch, and they had set a 24-hour watch in the NMCC, and I was the medical watch captain, and I was on the night watch. I had the night shift. There was only 2 watches, 12 and 12, but you were there for like 16 hours because you had to go through the turnovers at the beginning and the end. In any event, nothing has happened. Where there's nothing to do. There's no bodies to recover. There's no people to rescue. There's nothing. There's nobody to go and attack immediately. We knew virtually immediately it was Al Qaeda and Osama bin Laden behind it. But those people were a long way away, and all of the people who were on the planes were dead, of course. So I'd gone up to the old area because I'd been on the Chief of Naval Operations staff just 4 or 5 years before. And I walked to the edge of where the maw began, where literally the floor was gone. And they put up this plywood wall with a door on it. And it had a lock, just a regular, key lock. And it was hanging off. So I pulled it open, and it was like looking into, Dante's Inferno. They still had all the Clevites. They're looking for body pieces still around the clock. And it's off-gassing, terrible human, remains smells and alive, and there's still flash fires and pieces burning. It was actually an asbestos in the air. It was a very dangerous place to be. So and the office that had come was the last to be semi-destroyed was the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Plans and Ops, the N3, N5, right next to the Vice Chief of Naval Operations office, who had been kind of the guy who'd taken my career along, Admiral Joseph Preer. And I looked into the office, and as I'm looking in the office, there's these 2 flags, nylon flags, on wooden poles. One's an American flag, one's a Navy flag, and they had brass bases. And the fire had come through the floor right there. The room was destroyed. The Admiral's desk, which was like a 9-foot, big C desk, mahogany wood. It was beautiful, cracked in half. There was broken things all over the place. But fire had come up, and it burned the brass plate and started to burn the wood on these flagpoles. But the flags were nylon, and they didn't melt. And I'm looking at this in absolute wonderment when a civilian engineer comes and he taps me on my shoulder. I almost jumped out of my boondockers. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. And he says, "Commander, what are you doing here, man? This is so dangerous. You shouldn't be here." And I didn't say anything to him. I just turned halfway and I pointed at the flags. And he goes, "Yeah, isn't that remarkable?" He said, and I said, "Who do they belong to?" He said, "Well, the Navy Museum and the Smithsonian were here today to take artifacts, and anything that's left is, as far as I'm concerned, fair game." So without saying another word, because he knew it was on my mind, he turns, and I don't know where he found it, but he turns, he's gone 3 seconds. He comes back with a shopping bag, right? And we silently take down the 2 flags, the Navy flag, the American flag first. And he must have been a Boy Scout or something because he knew how to do the trifold. And it was like a ceremony. He handed it to me, and I put it to my chest, put it in the bag. That flag sits right there right now. And the thing about that flag and the Navy flag, Tony, which is in the storage in our basement, is that 20 years later, if I open up that shadow box for you, people go like this because you get the strongest smell of fire and JP5 fuel.
Yeah, and it's still impregnated. Yeah, those sense molecules are still embedded in the fabric.
Yeah, so that's my memento of that fateful day.
Wow.
So I just want to talk, to close this out briefly about lessons not learned, and I'll start off by saying that there was obviously the 9/11 Commission that was asked to look into what had occurred, and they came up with 3 final strategic recommendations, if you will. I'm sure you and many of the people who would listen to something like that would be familiar with them. But the first one was to increase our intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR assets, to be able to detect, deter, and detect to defend against future terrorist attack. Which, that's a whole conversation in and of itself, because all of our ISR assets, which were mostly space-based, were architected to look at big troop movements. The Republican Guard invading Kuwait, the former Soviet Union, coming. Yeah,
they were designed for the Cold War.
Yeah, they weren't designed to find a guy, carrying a little case like this around with, filled with dried anthrax in it, And so and that's what initiated Rumsfeld's quote unquote transformation. That became the hot buzzword after 9/11. We had to transform the entire, not only intelligence architecture of the United States, but our military to fight asymmetrical war in what is now the fourth generation of warfare. Non-state actors with who are not fighting for global or regional hegemony, but actually fighting for religious ideology and other ideologies that still, for many people, is very hard to understand why they would be willing to do so much and go up against, at least one of the only surviving superpowers. And in any event, the second finding was to increase communication capability between the first responder community, because as you know, they couldn't talk to each other in New York.
Exactly.
Fire, EMS, and police all were operating on different bandwidth.
There was no interoperability, and to some degree, there still isn't.
No, there still isn't.
In a lot of places.
And that's it's much more, it's ingrained. It's part of a cultural norm that, when we laugh and we're drinking beers with each other in an Irish bar in New York, it's the Italians who are the police and the Irish who are the firemen. And it's a culture war. And as much as they hate to admit it, they really have not changed as well as they need to. And I know this because I was the New York State Director of Emergency Management from 2013 through 2014. And it was one of the issues that I was still working on at the time. And the third thing was kind of goofy. It was almost like a fallback to the 1940s and 50s. And it was increased democratization initiatives in countries that we know are capable of proliferating, future terrorists. Change their hearts and minds, and maybe they won't come attack us in another generation, which we haven't been successful at either. In any event, and here's the key point: when we looked at really what occurred, mainly in New York City, where the big casualty load was, my colleague David Campbell, who at the time was the CEO of St. Vincent's Hospital, which had been designated as the primary casualty and receiving hospital for the World Trade Center casualties, later in a very important article that appeared in Frontiers in Modern Healthcare, the flagship journal of the American College of Healthcare Executives, coined the term catastrophic casualty anomaly to apply to what happened on 9/11. And it very simply means that there were more fatalities than there were casualties that were going to demand critical care support from our hospital infrastructure. And why is this important? Well, we've been hearing throughout this pandemic the term surge capacity and protect the surge. We know, that is, people who work in public health preparedness and disaster medicine, like I have done for most of my career, know that surge is sort of the key to everything. And what Campbell said in labeling 9/11 a catastrophic casualty anomaly, and how this relates to the 9/11 Commission report, was if the reverse had been true, meaning there were 3,000 critical care injuries involving fire and burn support, severe trauma support, heavy surgical support, they would have needed beds. And because we have existed in a system called managed care for the past 30 plus years in the United States, where hospitals have been designated as essentially profit centers, we have no excess in our healthcare system, none.
It's just in time supply chain, which is a big problem.
Issue. And if hospital beds are laid empty, then they're a money pit, meaning there's nothing coming into the hospital. So they have refined the profit margin so perfectly at this point that without these types of emergencies, pandemics, terrorist attacks, etc., we don't see what a sudden demand spike would look like. But we have in COVID, and we've come dangerously close to collapsing parts or whole sections of our healthcare infrastructure because we lack the surge capacity to pulse up to the levels of demand that are outside the normal parameters of our daily patient census.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
and we've been harping on the need for surge capacity for decades.
Well, the funny thing about it is during the Cold War, when we had the former civil defense programs, we built enormous surge capacity by way of actual beds and medical supplies. We in the peak of the Cold War period in 1960.
I'm losing you a little bit.
in the peak of the Cold War period, in like the 1960s, we had something like between 3 and 6 million beds distributed out throughout the United States in the event of an attack by the Soviets using nuclear weapons. All that's gone away. And I argue that in an era that's dominated now by asymmetrical threats and non-state actors with a wide panoply of weapons of mass destruction against the C-Bernie spectrum, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, and high explosive, we're at more risk now. So David's point, just back to kind of wrap this up in a neat little bow, was if that would have happened, meaning we would have had that demand placed on us right as a result of the events on 9/11, we would have broken the back of the healthcare infrastructure across the entire East Coast. He says from Boston to Washington, D.C., probably further. And a sort of a PS to that is not only would the beds not have been there, but we would have needed transportation assets to get the patients to the beds. So that's another surge piece we don't have. Even if we had the beds, the movement would have been essentially impossible. And David's final comment, or actually this is my comment, is if the 9/11 Commission would have recognized what the shortfall was that seemed invisible to them at the time, I believe the findings of the entire 9/11 Commission would have been vastly different. And they would have been focused on the single portion of our infrastructure nationally that's responsible for saving lives and reducing suffering. And if we believe that future terrorism is an inevitability because they fight their wars in generational ways, which is very hard to understand, or if we just have to assume that we're going to face other large-scale natural disasters, in some cases seasonal, like we're seeing now with climate change and these increased meteorological patterns that are having so significant an impact on us, if we don't start paying attention to this point, what will happen eventually will be, as Max Watkins and Max Bazerman and Mike Watkins at Harvard said, it will be a predictable surprise. We should have seen these disasters coming and accommodated for them, but now we're 21 years into this century, and we've gone through not only 9/11, but Katrina and Sandy and Maria and Ida and just now the flooding in the tri-state region of New York. And we still have not changed the preparedness paradigm, 2 degrees off top dead center. We're not even close yet. So we've missed, on this anniversary, it's a good time to remind ourselves that this is something we have to continue to study. We have to assess, and we have to apply the lessons learned or not learned. It's probably better to these disasters that continue to affect our country and other parts of the world that we have very significant interest in, and really begin to change how we do business. Final note, this is the final note, Tony. There was an exercise 80 days to the day before 9/11 called Dark Winter. And
yes.
In the late 1990s, we had been receiving increased, intelligence about the proliferation of biological weapons around the world by some of the very actors, we're talking about here, the truly bad guys that got a hold of a lot of the stuff that the Soviet Union had been doing before they dissolute in 1991. So smallpox is the worst case scenario. We sometimes refer to it as the dark cave scenario in the intelligence arena that knows anything about biological or asymmetrical threats involving terrorism. So they wanted to exercise this scenario, and the exercise was scheduled for 8 days. And by the way, this Dark Winter exercise was the first of what later became known as the Top Off or Top Officials Exercise Program.
Yeah, they were the annual Top Off events. Yeah,
right. And now it's the national level exercises, the NLEs, and they ended up shutting the.
I've lost your signal a little.
Yeah, they ended up shutting the exercise off after 3.5 hours because the scenario broke the back of the play. And they put a lessons learned findings together. It was 5 lessons learned, and they're shocking.
Peter, I didn't hear that last of it.
I said they
broke
put
up a little bit.
Yeah, they put a lessons learned. Even though the exercise play was a dramatic failure, they did put together lessons learned, and there's 5 of them. And the interesting thing now, Tony, is if you take smallpox out and insert COVID-19, they are identical to by way of predicting what would be the exact mistakes that we have been making through this COVID pandemic. Yeah.
Well, Peter, I know you've got run, but I really appreciate you taking the time to give your perspective on all of this, and where we still need to go. We've harped on this forever about the need for surge capacity, and we've seen it with this pandemic. I mean, some states don't even have ICU beds, let alone inpatient beds, and it's just getting worse. And I want you back on the program because I think we need to do an update on where things are at with the pandemic and where it's going to go.
Well, I'd of course like that, Tony. I appreciate an opportunity to speak with you and to have a chance to talk about these important issues with your audience. My last comment is tomorrow is an anniversary of a very, very dark moment in our nation's history, and some of us lost friends and family members and loved ones, and I just ask that we never forget